quick slides. Thank you very much, and give you a sense of what we're looking at as well. There's that nice map of Europe with a couple of little pipelines running across it as well. So let's move ahead to the next slide, please. Great. What I'm trying to suggest with this slide is that energy security for many years has sat on the outside of policy making, largely to do with commodities and the private market, if you like, of energy providers, which is a very busy area in Europe as well. Now, energy security has slid closer and closer into the middle in terms of what defines the foreign policy of the European Union as a whole, and its geopolitical survival. So if you can see on the diagram, the overlap between the EU foreign policy structure on the one side, which is your traditional use of diplomacy and alliances and trade instruments, and energy security on the other. This means that energy security effectively is part of the toolbox that the EU uses in order to undertake relationships difficult and challenging on the one side and cooperative on the other. Going down on the right-hand side, you can see the word strategic autonomy. This is, I think, for everybody, the idea that you can try to be self-sufficient. The problem is you're so dependent on energy in Europe, more so than many. It's really hard to be able to stand on your 2 feet in order to act wholly independently. But I think it's probably better to think of it as sort of de-risking, if you like, sort of stages of de-risking. And that's what Europe is trying to do. It's trying to de-risk its energy security. The irony is the closer you put it to foreign policy, the harder it is to de-risk, because there's much in foreign policy which is very, very strategic and risky in and of itself. So you can see the tension already bundled up in that sort of little molecule look. Right, let's move ahead to the next slide and see where that architecture takes us. If I can divide it really briefly into in three sort of phases. If we just go back to the the good old days, if you like, pre-Brexit or even pre-earlier than that, what you do is you get a sense of energy being quite liberalized, being quite regulated for the most part, and quite predictable. So the EU at this point didn't see it, I think, from 2016 onwards as a really definitive part of its policy. And as I've suggested there, treated energy really as a market commodity issue and left it to the markets to deal with as well. But the problem is at this point, you get a massive dependency on the kind of gas and electricity and oil coming in from external areas. And that's a problem, because if any of these areas, like Russia or Ukraine, suddenly has a geopolitical issue in and of itself, then you get the spike. And that's what happens. The invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, where energy and energy security moves into the middle of that geopolitical circle I mentioned before and becomes weaponized. And the difficulty, which is manageable in markets in terms of dependency, suddenly takes on a whole new area of risk, if you like. And it's a wake-up call for the European Union. And as Mustafa's going to tell us in a minute or two, one of the biggest, most radical changes we've seen in the European Union is to come up with a sort of strategic autonomy approach and say, we will try to de-risk as much as possible. And that effectively, in a nutshell, means trying to shut off the bulk of imports, largely in gas, largely from Russia. But that leaves them with phase three, which is a very weird sort of mishmash, if you like, of a very fragmented understanding of what energy is, who to import it from, whether it's safe, whether it's not, and trying to pick up the remnants of the fuel crisis, which goes back to 2022, with its own requirements, its own very big green ambitions in terms of climate change. So the EU finds itself trying to do all sorts of things at the same time, scramble for these clean energy technologies, trying to put a hand up against the aggression from Russia by saying we disagree with you politically, and we'll use energy security as a method of talking about that. Let's move on to the next slide. So Repower EU, very briefly, is put together by the then HRVP, the High Representative Vice President Borrell, in 2022 as quite a radical demand reduction. It's the first time the EU really gets together in real harmony, speaking with one voice, which is always the foreign policy goal, and reduces gas demand quite a lot, actually. I think it might be higher than that between 2022 and 2025 by basically looking at the gas pipelines and severing as much as they possibly can, as well as gas from other areas, but also oil too. And beginning also to think about joint purchasing, so purchasing from other folks, having a sort of a portfolio, if you like, a more stackable portfolio of where to get your gas and oil as well. And as I mentioned before, really pushing ahead on the climate change, so accelerating renewable deployment. So again, save, diversify, clean. It's trying to do three things all at the same time, which is difficult from a market perspective, but also challenging from a foreign policy perspective. So let's roll ahead, get to the good stuff. What we've got here is one of the biggest ambitions from the European Commission that really starts in sort of 2019, gets a bit waylaid with COVID, and then gets waylaid again with the invasion of Ukraine. But the idea is to sort of refocus Europe's ambition, despite the fact it's really vulnerable and still quite dependent on oil and gas, to refocus it on the European Green Deal. And there are a variety of big policies here that are kind of stackable, if you like. At the bottom are a whole host of agreements that filter into the EU economy, driven by the UN, largely driven from the Paris Agreement of about 10 years ago, and pushing ahead with those climate neutrality targets roughly to 2050, although some of the deadlines are earlier, 2030. The second one is the emissions trading system, which is actually rather old. It's been around a good 20 years. The idea that you can capture the carbon, you can trade the carbon, you can sequester the carbon, you can and you can cost the carbon as well, and try and cap it as well, and effect a strict price, and basically build a carbon market. I would say the EU has been successful to some extent, but it's now so difficult to identify where carbon is across the entire supply chain, within all the moving parts, if you like, of the European Union, and identifying it and costing it, and then costing it again when it goes across the border, is quite mind-blowing. So if the EU is making headway here, then that's quite impressive. And the top one, of course, shows you how far they've got, the carbon border adjustment mechanism as well. So it's a real determination to try to decarbonize not just markets, but key industries within the European Union, and to push and try to get them to adopt those EU green standards. We'll see if they get there. Next slide, please. So a couple of stress tests to finish with, and I think we're all kind of profoundly aware of it. The Middle East shock has pushed Europe even further into looking at itself as an energy provider, an energy user, an energy actor. Certainly, the good news is that the EU has demonstrated it can move quickly. It did successfully decouple from Russia for the most part. And it has identified where it's weak. It's identified those volatile fossil fuel choke points. But the problem is there's not a great deal it can do about all of them. So it's one thing to wean yourself off gas and to go to talk to the Norwegians and the Qataris and the Algerians, that's fine. But oil is still a huge part of the European makeup. And oil still comes through some very key pinch points, including the Strait of Hormuz as well. So the immediate chokehold that we're seeing is affecting absolutely everybody. It's tripping everybody up in terms of the global energy transit, and it's slowing Europe down as a result as well. So let's move on. With regards to the US, and this is kind of less to do with energy, and I think more to do with the general sort of ecosystem. I think the one thing that I can say interestingly is that with the first Trump administration, we saw so many tariffs being levied and then released, and then levied again and then released. And it's not dissimilar to the sort of gas spats that the European Union has a great deal of experience with, actually, going back the last 20 or 30 years. The problem is it makes the market incredibly volatile. It's difficult to predict. You're not quite sure where this is a presidential spat or it's actually part of a larger form of the sort of trade-based, commodity-based volatilities going back and forth. What it has done is it's pushed the global tariff up. It's appreciated the euro as well. It's made critical sectors, and I've just suggested a couple here, like German industry and hard machinery and Irish pharmaceuticals. It's made them face real profound uncertainty because they've got tariffs being slapped on top of them. And what they have to think about is whether they want to continue, to operate in the way they do. And the connection is they cannot operate without the use of energy. And we're seeing it certainly in the UK as well. How well and how green your business is, it relies entirely upon your use of gas and electricity in particular, and oil. And if that volatility, that macro volatility in the energy world is causing problems in the business world, and then the business world is having increased problems because of tariffs, it's a bit of a perfect storm. Let's finish with one final slide because I'm aware of the time sliding away. The EU's relationship, I think, and this is very much the same with the UK, in terms of navigating China, it's a bit of a paradox. You see some really good alignment and some good commercial uptake, particularly in the green tech market, global green tech, but also some serious drivers that continue to make and render tense in terms of the monopolistic grip from China on the one side on the industrial chains. And the EU has done some work here, I think, in trying to jump into those and break those apart. A really nice example is the Critical Raw Materials Act and also the Foreign Subsidies Regulation. So using investment kind of preemptively, if you like, to get ahead of some of these choke points. At the beginning, Isabel talked a little bit about Britain and England. I think just 2 points on this before I finish that with Brexit, Britain obviously decoupled itself politically and largely financially from the European Union, and it has stepped back from many of the climate change sort of focal points, if you like, that the European Union had led on. But I think in the last couple of years, under the Labour government, it has swung back a bit. And I think the UK feels that it's perhaps more at home with the European Union in terms of where it wants to go from a climate change perspective. So I think things are looking rather positive. And I'll just end with a quote from former Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair, who just simply refuses to go away. And his suggestion that the fossil fuel idea of continuing to tap the North Sea, he calls this utterly bizarre in the face of energy and climate crises. So ironically, despite the fact that he doesn't have the greatest credentials in terms of Middle East, he's turning into something of a sort of an energy spokesman and really arguing against the abandoning of net zero and the suggestion that we should increase oil and gas drilling. He sees this as diametrically opposed to our connections with the United Nations and ultimately will just cause more instability. And with that, I will finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We're just taking a moment to find Mahmoud because, as with our colleagues last week, we appear to have misplaced him. However, just asking Mustafa now to step up to the plate. Mustafa, are you ready to go?
Always.
Thank you, Amelia.
Okay, I think my PPT is with you, my presentation, and I will continue where Emilia left from. It's going to be completing it, I think.
We practiced this beforehand, by the way, so Mustafa will just smoothly pick up from some of the macro themes that I've finished with. It's so elegant. It's going to blow your mind. Yeah.
Hopefully. Yes, I can start, I think, to use our time wisely. Good morning from London. Thank you. I will examine how energy security is reshaping the European Union's power politics and tying defense, security, and some other policies around energy. I will try to propose a formula for the EU just to be an ecosystem for the member states. Can you move to the other slide, please? Yeah. Yes, I will start with some questions, and these questions are guiding my research. And I think so, by and large, yeah. The EU has long treated energy as a market. I think Emilia very rightly highlighted that EU was relying on markets for energy security, but markets failed in this age of geopolitics to provide an energy security. EU has long treated energy as a market, regulatory and climate issue. However, recent crises show that energy now sits at the heart of foreign policy, defense planning, and also geopolitical competition and power politics. And my central argument is that energy security is no longer a technical policy area. It has become a geopolitical foundation of the EU strategic autonomy and also a driver of deeper integration in areas that have traditionally remained very closely guarded by the member states, especially in areas where sovereignty concerns have historically blocked the progress. Can you move to the other slide, please? The next one. Yes. Energy geopolitics. By geopolitics, I mean where geographies, values of geographies are interpreted in terms of energy sources, supply chains, and vulnerabilities in relation to energy, of course. And today, what I'm going to try to do, I'm going to cover in a way. First, I will try to contextualize the era of energy. We are living in an era of energy, and what I mean in political terms, and the European Union in the era of energy power politics. And the following one, please, the next slide. And I would like to start with a quote from Adam Tooze, director of European Institute at Columbia University, recently in October 2025. He delivered a lecture and highlighting and defining the new Cold War. And he says the new Cold War isn't ideological, it is infrastructural. It's not about democracy versus authoritarianism, it's about energy systems, supply chains, and the material foundations of power. And within this new Cold War understanding, let's say, I will try to contextualize how European Union is doing. The following one, please. The Cold War is not simply about democracy versus authoritarianism, and instead, the new contest is about infrastructure of power, energy grids, supply chains, and industrial systems. And from this perspective, geopolitical influence depends on who can endure disruption and control indispensable networks. Disruptions, shocks needs to be, let's say, calculated and responded. And to what extent EU is responding. The following slide, please. Yes. Why energy matters now? In my research, I try to adopt a broad understanding of energy security, and we work with Emilia, and we try to build a framework to analyze and to apply the energy security in this new digital and also geopolitical era. It is not simply about independence from foreign suppliers, rather it's about building a resilient, diversified, and sustainable system that can withstand shocks while remaining economically open. Once framed in this way, energy security becomes inseparable from industrial capacity and diplomatic leverage and defense readiness as well. And we must, from this perspective, we must look toward the near future to understand why energy is becoming even more indispensable than it was in the past. When we look at from this perspective, we see that energy is transitioning from a mere commodity, that was the case in the past, into the very oxygen of our digital economies. And I'm particularly focusing on how our AI-driven systems, data centers, and are creating a new relentless demand for power. And within that context, any disruptions becomes a top-tier national security risk. Also, another point, the green transition, that doesn't necessarily solve our security dilemmas. Instead, it complicates by introducing deep dependencies on critical minerals and complex supply chains needed for wind and solar technology especially. I believe we are entering a period where the weaponization of energy will extend beyond fossil fuels. When we look at the mainstream discussions, they only focus on the fossil fuels, so it is beyond that. We need to include electricity and clean energy technology. And ultimately, I argue that guaranteeing these energy flows is the only way to prevent industrial decline and avoid the social dislocation, especially in the European Union, that would follow an increasingly energy-hungry world. The next one, please. Yes, energy is emerging as a tool of geopolitics in the first quarter of the 21st century. And this role is not new. but it has intensified and diversified with incorporation of new energy sources. Before it was limited to fossil fuels, but now we have lithium, rare earth materials, some other key strategic minerals, empowering modern economies and societies. Historically, we're going to refer to 1973 oil crisis to show how energy could be weaponized diplomatically. But now we have, in addition to fossil fuels, we have many other areas. What is different today is that coercion spans fossil fuels, electricity, LNG, and many others. For example, Russia's gas cuts and China's leverage over critical minerals, such as export limitation, very well shows that energy and energy-related inputs are once again being used, but this time at a higher level, as an instrument of geopolitical and geoeconomic pressure. The next one, please. But before that, maybe, can we just go back one slide, please, if you don't mind? Yeah. Electoral state, another interesting term, which is becoming highly popular nowadays. Yeah. A major conceptual tool to understand new Cold War tension over energy. To better understand this new tension over energy, we need to distinguish between electoral states and petrostates, some experts they argue. By electoral states, what we mean, electoral states, they are not just green economies, of course, they are systems where electricity is deeply embedded in industry, logistics, not only industry, logistics, planning, and even governance as well. On the other side, we have petrostate, very traditional economies. By contrast, they derive strength from oil and fossil fuels, especially gas extraction, and control over transport choke points, of course, like Strait of Hormuz. And the argument is that these are competing models of power in the 21st century. Petrostates, and we see emergence of electrostates, maybe any level. And AI, next one, please. Another key point to highlight, AI and data centers, they are the force that makes electricity central to geopolitical competition. They require massive and uninterrupted, always-on power systems and cannot tolerate instability. And for them, renewables for the time being with the existing technologies are not enough. We are in a way reducing our consumption of the fossil fuels in our daily lives. But when we look at the increasing number of data centers, they are relying on fossil fuels because they require uninterrupted, always-on power. This means the key constraints on economic expansion is no longer only innovation in code or chips, but the ability to provide resilient electrical infrastructure at scale. All the economies, even the government, is to an extent, especially in the near future, will be highly dependent, relying on data centers. The next one, please. AI era power demand is in a way exposing the limits of 20th century grid design, not enough anymore. And traditional centralized grids were built for relatively stable and predictable patterns of demand. And we were living relatively in a predictable, let's say, economic environment in the previous century, but now highly volatile and dynamic. The new environment requires localized, resilient, and continuous power systems so that storage technologies, microgrids, and behind-the-meter energy systems are framed as the strategic infrastructure rather than niche climate tools in the relevant literature. The next one, please. In this new era, power belongs less to those who speak most effectively about values and more to those who build indispensable infrastructure. We are not living in the age of values anymore, but in the age of infrastructure to an extent. And reliable electrical systems, computing capacity, and the supply chains that support them are presented as the real levers of geopolitical influence. And accordingly, the power politics is going to be unpacked in this 21st century, maybe especially in the second quarter of 21st century. The next one, please. Yeah, to understand the future and role of energy union, European Union as an energy union, we must look at the foundational bedrock of the EU, with reference to, of course, European coal and steel community. And when we look at this quote from a former French foreign minister, Robert Schuman, as you already know, yeah, he was one of the key figures in building European Union. He says French government proposes to place all Franco-German coal and steel production under a common high authority, Yeah. Energy security is once again playing this role, acting as an integrative force that can help advance integration. At that time, to build the European Union, they benefited from this common high authority to, in a way, integrate, to, in a way, build a union, a political union, build an ecosystem. Rather than a political union, I think calling European Union maybe an ecosystem of the member states would make more sense. Yeah, integration began with strategic resources at that time, then expanded into broader political domains. That can be the case now as well, but not only limited to, of course, fossil fuels, coal, but other areas as well. Next one,
Mustafa,
please.
I don't
Yeah.
mean to interrupt. I just want to let you know that you've just passed the 10 minutes.
Oh.
So if you could start wrapping up, because then we need to move on to Mahmoud, because we've got to finish at 10. That's why. Okay. Thank you.
With
Thanks.
3 minutes, I will have completed. Okay, thank
Thank
you. Yeah, very briefly, the EU as the ecosystem of member states and the new emerging world energy and energy security is key. My point to again make the European Union as a global actor. And when we talk about the energy, it is not limited to fossil fuels. And also the dependencies are really important in diversification. We are not only talking about diversification of the fossil fuels, but also other elements that are being used to generate. And EU, I think if we link it to the electoral state, concept of electoral state, EU is a good candidate of becoming an electoral state and generating electricity. And to generate electricity, it needs some certain elements, rare earth materials, fossil fuels as well, to empower the data centers. And that is the new era, our point. And if we jump to the conclusion, to use our time, to highlight, maybe, And if you just move to the last slide, if you don't mind, please. I had a proposal, but I think I don't have enough time. Maybe when we publish, you can read about the proposal, the framework. And the conclusion is that the European Union should not be understood as a sovereign state, but as a union of states, as an ecosystem with significant regulatory authority across the internal market. And its strongest powers, it lies in coordination, regulation, and market governance. On the other side, while foreign policy, defense, and other sovereignty-sensitive areas, they remain highly limited and constrained by member state control and intergovernmental bargaining. And in the emerging era of energy, geopolitics, and rivalry among electorate states, EU is a good candidate. EU's historic role is therefore not to become a state in the traditional sense, but to transform its member states so they are collectively better prepared for strategic competition. And the pathway can be summarized through interest convergence, means member states must increasingly treat energy exposure and infrastructure vulnerability as a common European problems, like they did in 1950s. And then energy security institutionalization are really important. That requires stronger common mechanisms on grids, raw materials, and resilience, and of course, crisis response. And finally, political integration that remains necessary because foreign and security policy still suffers from fragmentation and unanimity constraints, while strategic autonomy depends on Europe developing territorial and industrial capacity to protect infrastructure and sustain critical supply chain. And to make this credible, the EU also needs supporting capabilities in maritime projection, maybe in security as well, diplomatic security competence. Otherwise, it risks remaining a sophisticated regulatory order in a geopolitical environment increasingly shaped by the hard power. I think that's going to be my last point here, just in a way linking hard power to provide energy security, which EU lacks for the time being.
Thank
Thank
you so much, Mustafa. I had never really thought about the entirety of the European Union as being a giant disaster preparedness strategy, but strangely, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much. Now, we have recovered him. Mahmoud, are you ready to go? I'm slightly worried about our ability to lose grown men, but we're glad we get them back again. I'd like to thank everybody for their questions, and also Amelia, Mustafa, and Mahmoud for their presentations. We have got an awful lot of questions, as I'm sure you can understand. We've got one that is it's from Ambassador Dr. Victoria, which is, how can these threats be reduced to as low as reasonably possible in low income and developing countries? And it's a particularly pertinent question because we're also not that great at dealing with those threats in high income countries. So we might throw to Mustafa first. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to limit you to 1 minute. The clock is running.
Yeah, I think one single word maybe would be enough. Cooperating more. We need platforms to discuss and maybe create new opportunities to cooperate, especially between developing low-income countries and high-income countries. Like European Union, for example, is a regulatory body, and maybe more projects. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Amelia?
Well, I think it's much to do with the kind of infrastructure, and Mahmoud has looked at this very, very neatly. Your geographies are very different country by country, so it's incredibly important that you have intelligent structures and intelligent infrastructures set up that are working with the kind of climate that you already have. So sub-Saharan Africa energy security structures are going to be wildly different than those perhaps set up by Canada in the high north. That's quite a change of attitude. I think energy structures largely have been top down, build it, leave it. But now I think a much more community driven, bottom up, working with local stakeholders, and very community driven and responsive, I think much more sensible approaches to building energy security will probably go further faster.
Thank you so much. And to finish us off on this one, Mahmoud.
Yes, actually, you mentioned low-income countries. I would say actually we have got some projects with Nigeria currently. We are working closely with them. I mean, some countries in terms of like low-income countries, I mean, often face a combination of technical, financial, environmental, and governance challenges. That these challenges can significantly affect the reliability and resilience of their energy infrastructure. I would say the main suggestion of mine would be preparedness, like preparing in advance in terms of energy resilience. I mean, whenever you want to design and install an energy infrastructure, then you need to think about like what protective measures you can put into place even during design stage to mitigate all those threats during operation and maintenance side.
Thank you so much. Now, it wouldn't be a joint seminar if we did not have questions from Udoak, who I would like to thank again for his engagement and interest. The first of which is in the questions here. China has used, and this one Udoak directs directly to Amelia. But I think it's a question that applies to all of you. China has used energy as an instrument of industrialization, linking energy, industry, trade, R&D, economic policies, resulting in China controlling a large share of value chains and markets for solar-related technologies. How is the EU building industrial capabilities in renewable energy technology to make it internationally competitive, for example, with China? I think we all want an answer to that question.
That is an excellent question. As I think I tried to show, the relationship is a delicate one. Sometimes it can be very good and competitive from a beneficial perspective, pushing tech on, increasing resilience, increasing market spread. But it's true, there are very real challenges, and I think the European Union at this point has largely been caught on the back foot because for many years it has subsidized its own solar power commodities, which makes it largely unmarketable in many ways. They're not fit for purpose from a competitive perspective. And into that gap, China has sort of leapt and moved ahead. But I still think there's a lot of potential for co-design. If there's anything that we've learned about green tech, actually, that you go further faster in terms of collaboration. So I wouldn't necessarily describe China as all-encompassing. I think in its ability to get across markets and value chains. I would simply say that it has a dominance that the European Union could easily find as a counterpart in terms of next generation solar power or next generation photovoltaic or next generation batteries, for example. So I'd like to, as the European Union does, try to find ways where they can play nicely in the same sandpit without knocking each other out. And this is why an international treaty like the United Nations, like Paris, like the UNFCCC, is so incredibly important. Those are the multilateral forums where you can get potentially competitors in a market, but complementary players politically to get together and agree something that everybody can use.
Which perhaps leads us to a last question, which is who is the most effective actor to facilitate such conversation? Does the UN have agency in this space, and how might we as constituent countries act as effective actors? Mustafa, do you want to go first with this one? I notice everyone's going to have to run out in 2 minutes. So 30 seconds or less. Go.
Would you mind repeating the question again, please? I missed the part.
Emil, we need a multilateral framework to regulate, to engage with, and to oversee this transition. Is this something the UN can do? And if not the UN, who might be best placed? And how can we as constituent countries help enable that?
I think it should be something UN should do, of course can do, but maybe partnering. European Union also can play an important role as well. I think linking to the previous question, how just to compete with China. I think the term compete is quite interesting because so far European Union has seen China as a threat, but rather than seeing as a threat, maybe just seeing as a partner to cooperate with, just to build together, to balance it together. Because if you see it as a threat, you are going to react accordingly. To see it as a trap. But rather than seeing it as a threat, seeing it as a partner, maybe will solve. And if the big players become partners, I think it's going to be easier for the UN to become a platform as well. Maybe the big players first are going to take the initiative to show, to build, and they're going to cooperate with the smaller players as well. I think so. The big players should be convinced.
Thank you. Amelia, do you concur?
I do. I was just typing a couple of things in the chat there. Look, you're going to need, it's always a three-way split, isn't it? National, regional, and international. Yesterday in London at the Methodist Hall, the 4 new candidates for the Secretary General of the United Nations were throwing their hat into the ring. And it's interesting how much climate change came up. And they all talked about it strategically. So I think there's a real need, there's a real desire, there's a real appetite for the UN to continue to lead on this, but it's got to get its act together. It needs to be much more focused. It needs to have teeth in terms of those treaties. It needs to work better with leading regions. The European Union is one, Mercosur is another, ASEAN, Gulf Cooperation Council. The UN needs to be able to pull those regional levers, and the region themselves need to pull those national levers as well. That's a system that can work.
That certainly sounds like something we can get on board with. Mahmoud, I will leave you the final word before I wrap up.
Yes, I would say in that regard, like investment in innovation and R&D, especially in cutting-edge areas like AI, clean energy, advanced manufacturing, biotechnology, and semiconductors is very essential to grow energy businesses in the future across Europe and make ourselves more competitive with other parties. And also, we need to work and think and rethink about critical skills. To be honest, I mean, we are educators, so we are part of university. We are educating our students to prepare them in terms of being the next generations of energy security and energy resilience bodies. So we need to make sure that those education elements incorporate all those sort of skills that they require to have in place to be like a part of the business in the future. Like I could mention some skills like data analytics. I could mention some skills like intellectual property and business management, and also some sort of like sensors and machine learning and digital twin technologies as well.
All right, thank you. We are skidding into the home plate sideways. There is mud going everywhere, but we made it. Thank you all. Thank you, Amelia. Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you, Mahmoud. Like to thank all our panelists right across the whole series. This has been an outrageously fantastic thing to be a part of. I will meet with Amelia and Iwoma to sort out how we might look at similar events moving forward. Again, check your inboxes for your CFAL completion certificates. I wish you all a joyful rest of day, and I look forward to engaging with you all soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Brody.
Thank
for
you,
this
everyone.
conversation.
Thank
Thank you very much,
Thank
Brody.
Thank you so much.
Good
It's been lovely.
discussion. Thank you.